Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have lost 4-1. Now, I should say that the score is obviously a bit misleading in this one. It was 2-1 up until the Minnesota Wild potted 2 empty net goals, but in the end, the Sharks losing the game is still the Sharks losing the game, despite what the score may have ended up being had there not been any empty net goals. And this one started off, I guess you could say, not well for the Sharks, but the Wild would end up being the team to score the first goal with Eriksson X, third of the year. The Sharks would soon after tie it up with Matt Nieto, and then we would remain tied at 1 for a decent while before Zach Parise would break that tie and make it 2-1. The Sharks continue with this season continued their struggles in the second period by giving up that goal, and the Sharks would not be able to get another one past Talbot at the start and then Kakkonen at the end, and as I said, they would drop it 4-1. So while I do prefer the fact that the Sharks, I like it better when the Sharks are losing 2-1 compared to when they're losing 5-4, if that makes any sense. Not that I enjoy them losing, but I feel as though it is easier to try and get the defense down pat and the defense much more solid and then work on the offense compared to the other way around. So at the very least, there is some slight improvements here in my eyes from the Sharks' standpoint. First thing to talk about would be Devin Dubnik. So surprisingly, after Jones's very solid performance in the second outing against the St. Louis Blues, Bob Booner thought back to how things went after Jones's strong first game of the season and then not so strong follow-up, and decided to instead start Devin Dubnik for this first game in Minnesota, and maybe also because this is Dubnik's former team where he played a few years for, so maybe it's nice to give him the first look. And Dubnik was okay. Obviously, he only actually let in 2 goals. The major problem is that this was a very closely played game, and the fact is that you take a look at this Parise goal, and he didn't have too much of a chance on that, but you take a look at this Eriksson Ek goal, and it's probably one he should have been able to save, and in the end, that is one of the difference makers in this game. Otherwise, it's a game that is tied at 1, and so it was not a bad game from Devin Dubnik, but he certainly didn't do the Sharks any favors by letting in that soft one, even if the Sharks only managed to score 1 goal anyway. Having said that, I suspect Jones will absolutely, and he should be, back in nets on Sunday when they take their rematch against Minnesota. Next thing to talk about would be Erik Karlsson. Now, I didn't really bring him up in the previous game, and yet it was Karlsson's likely best outing of the season in that second game against the St. Louis Blues. However, here tonight, he's sort of once again reverted back to the Karlsson that we saw through the first couple of games of the year. While there were still some really nice flashes of offensive play, it just seems as though Karlsson continues to get completely lost in the defensive zone. I mean, I pointed out that this Eriksson Ek goal should have never really gone in, but I do have to at least support Dubnik somewhat in the regard the fact that the Minnesota Wild had this 2-on-1 basically right in front of the net because Erik Karlsson was lost in no man's land in the middle of the ice, not really seemingly knowing what to do. And so a lot of people really bringing up the fact that Erik Karlsson's injury is something that's holding him back. And yes, the long-term effects of having the knee or the leg injury for himself have certainly maybe affected his speed somewhat, where we've seen him get beat far out wide a couple of times thus far this season, but we've also seen a lot of nice speed. There was one rush in particular where he showed insane speed in this game, but a lot of the issues that I'm having with Karlsson is not related to the speed aspect of his game, but is instead related to the positioning aspect of his game. And I never really watched Erik Karlsson all that much when he was with Ottawa, so I don't know if this is some sort of crazy sort of change of the trend of what he showed in Ottawa, or if this is just more of the same from Erik Karlsson. But what I'm seeing from now is just a very low level of defensive awareness. I've brought this up many times already this season, and I will say it again. Erik Karlsson, it just feels as though will occasionally find himself in the right place at the right time, but more so than any other defenseman on the Sharks, even Brent Burns will find himself sort of just floating around in the defensive zone, almost like he's playing left wing, hoping to try and make some sort of takeaway and then go for an offensive chance, and not really committed more to the defensive side. There was a reason why Ryan Merkley wasn't given a spot on the starting roster this season, and it was because he needed to work on his defensive game, and yet Erik Karlsson is here, who also would need to, in theory, work on his defensive game, and he plays 28 minutes a night. Next, I will be talking about Rem Schmuck. So, of course, as we know, the story with Schmuck is that his knee injury from the previous season, or actually from 2 seasons ago, I should say, has had these lingering effects and has been bothering him even up to this point. He did not play the first couple of games of this season, and in the last couple, he's only been playing very, very limited minutes. Once again, here tonight, he only played about 11 minutes on the ice with a pairing of Nizov, and I can definitely guarantee that if Schmuck were 100% healthy, even though he is on the third pairing, he'd likely at least be getting a good 14-15 minutes a night. So he's certainly taking a step back in terms of ice time. Having said that, it's kind of hard to tell that Schmuck even has that much of an issue. He still remained an extremely solid defenseman. Schmuck, one of my favorite players on the Sharks, because he just seems to do everything correct when he is on the ice, and that just seems to continue. So hopefully Schmuck can get healthy, because it will be a massive boon to the Sharks defensive unit if he can get back to 100% and get back to being able to play a lot more minutes every night. And finally, I will talk about Kevin Labanc, one of the players in the Sharks top 6. He signed a pretty big, I would say, new contract this offseason, and not many people were excited about it, and rightfully so. After a very strong season 2 years ago, he took a $1 million for 1 year contract as a favor to the San Jose Sharks to try and help them work in all the new contracts, especially Erik Karlsson's mammoth $11.5 million. However, after the end of that 1 year deal, Labanc was, owed, I guess you could say, a raise, and Doug Wilson went well on his word by giving Labanc almost $5 million over the next 4 years. And so the Sharks were hoping that Labanc would actually show up thus far in the season, and really it hasn't really happened all that much. He had a great chance at the end of this game to try and tie it up, but he ended up missing the net, and that's really just been the story of Kevin Labanc through the first 5 games of this season. There hasn't been all that much. A lot of the times when you're hearing Labanc's name, it's because he's taken an unfortunate offensive zone penalty thus far in this season, and just the Sharks' top 4 is already kind of frail, considering the fact that they only really have 4, I would say, established top 6 players, that being Kane, Meyer, Couture, and Hurdle, and Labanc was already kind of fringe, but hopefully going to be a consistent top 6 player, but that has yet to happen. So, at this point, Ryan Donato, who is rounding out the top 6, has almost been playing better than Kevin Labanc, I would say. In fact, I wouldn't even say almost. He absolutely has been playing better than Kevin Labanc at this point, and so Labanc definitely will need to pick it up, or else this contract, which already did not look very good at the time of signing it, will look even worse as time goes on. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday. They will take their rematch against the Minnesota Wild, and with Jones back in net and maybe a bit of a refresh, hopefully they'll end up getting their first regulation or overtime win of the season after their 2 previous wins have been in the shootout. Class dismissed.